Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. So if this is the first time you've ever checked it out, I'm Carlos, or because I'm Carlos, and I tend to do a lot of hobby-related videos and occasional live stream. So if you enjoy what you end up hearing here, I would be thrilled if you would subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, or hit the like button. Now let's talk a little bit about the subject of the video today. Today I want to talk about the whole idea of when did it stop being a kid's hobby or a child's hobby or whatever you want to call it. And this is an interesting conversation because there's a lot of differing opinions on it. But also at the same time, one quick thing I want to say off the top is that unfortunately, I'm going to present to you some things. I'm going to talk about a couple of possible checkpoints and some different ideas that could be argued about when things changed and when things shifted around. But one thing I'm going to tell you is that no matter what I come out of this video with, and I'll give you my opinion on it, but whatever I come out of this video with, we're not going to get consensus. And that's unfortunate because it would be really interesting to be able to kind of formulate one. But the reason we can't get a consensus is as simple as this: we don't really have an agreement on what the goalposts are. So even if I want to, it's like trying to figure out when a race was completed when nobody seems to agree on where the finish line was. So the race ended. We just don't know when exactly the time that was the final time because, well, I think the finish line is over here, and you think the finish line is 2 miles down the road, and we're both going to get different times, and depending on which one is the actual finish line, we could both, either one of us could be correct, and there's nothing wrong with the argument for it, but it's going to depend on where you put that finish line. And in the case of this one, really what it comes down to is what you define as the time in which the hobby changed. So when we're talking about the card hobby, some people would say it's when prices started escalating more, because there was always an escalation in prices. Because if we go back to the tobacco cards of the 19th century, well, most of those packs of cigarettes or tobacco cards were a penny a pack, so to speak. Well, obviously, even by the 1980s, well, you're talking about 35 cents a pack. So it's 35 times what it was, back in the day. But these are bubblegum cards, so maybe you put it as a different thing. But there are 5-cent packs of 54 Bowman and 1-cent packs of 54 Bowman that contain one card. And then you could still make all these comparisons and you could draw era by era. Now you could say inflation and price hikes, are part of it. Or you could say, when the price really started escalating in short order, that's when things changed over. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But the point is that's one metric you can use. You can use another metric where you've got the adults in the hobby in a more noticeable capacity. Another metric you could use is when we started really, you could say it goes as simply as when collectors started selling cards to other collectors instead of trading or bartering for them. When they started selling it to each other kind of for a profit, or when they started establishing kind of a pecking order, price guides, when full-time dealers came into effect. All of these are different distinct checkpoints that we can talk about that you could make a solid argument for as being the time in which the hobby became a little bit more of a business. Because from the manufacturer's perspective, it was always a business. Even from the very beginning, it was tobacco cards were to advertise a product. And then later on, as you went along the way, when you get to the post-war period, then you're talking about Bowman and then later Topps. Their job is to sell gum until such point that the cards became so popular that you were able to drop the gum and just sell the cards. So that's another aspect of it that you want to kind of consider is, well, it was always a profitable venture, hopefully for the manufacturer. Otherwise, it wouldn't stay in business. Otherwise, Bowman would have kept going after 1955. But the fact they didn't is that they weren't profitable enough to sustain it and to stay in that business. So they ended up being bought out by Topps, and then Topps had a monopoly. So all these different pieces tell you that it's going to be really hard to get a consensus on when these things happen because we can't even agree on what the finish line is, like I said. So let's talk about a couple of these checkpoints here, and then I'll get to kind of, like I said, part of my thesis and my thought process on this. So what I've got is this. The easiest and simplest one that I've heard explained out there, and I'll give credit here. He hardly the only person to mention it, but I'll give credit because it was one of the recent ones that I heard. So I was on a live stream with Jeremy Lee from Sports Cards Live, and one of the commenters, Amish Dave Archer, was nice enough to throw a comment in there, and he repeated it on his own live stream on his YouTube channel of the same name, Amish Dave Archer. You should, if you're interested in kind of a hobbyist talk, you should definitely check it out because they have the last podcast they had was upwards of like 3.5 hours. So if you put it on in the background and just want to enjoy some hobby talk, there's definitely a lot of that on there, and hijinks and a lot of it'll go around a lot of different paths. But there will be a lot of hobby talk on there, and it is a fun thing, and I enjoy what Dave makes. But one of the points he made was responding to my assertion on Jeremy's podcast was that I didn't think that that the hobby had been really a kid's hobby for a long time, And I'm going to amend that in this video because I've had a little more time to think about it, and I've actually kind of changed my position on it a little bit, but not in the way that maybe Dave would want. But Dave's point was that from his perspective, he looked at it from the price perspective. He thinks about it as when Upper Deck came into the game and suddenly introduced like a more premium pack price, that started the shift towards more of the business side of it. Now, I understand his point, and I think it's a reasonable one to make. But personally, I have to reject it because the truth is, it was already a business by that point, comfortably, because you had three competitors in the space. You had Donruss, you had Fleer, and you had Topps already. And then Upper Deck joined them, and then obviously produced what was a more premium product, obviously raising the bar in terms of photographic quality, the hologram on the back, and price. All true. But at the same time, if it didn't happen then, it was going to happen eventually because somebody was eventually going to start pushing the envelope because the point of these businesses is to make money. Upper Deck was able to distinguish themselves by creating this premium product. But there's also another factor we have to bear in mind. If the hobby was still quote unquote pure at that point and it's Upper Deck has somehow corrupted it, so to speak, it wasn't more a reflection, more the other way around, that Upper Deck saw the dollar signs and decided to get in on it, then the market would have rejected it. It would have looked at it and said, no, these are overpriced. This is what baseball cards should cost. We're not going to pay that. And then 1989 Upper Deck would have failed. Well, it didn't fail. It actually succeeded quite well, and Upper Deck went on to become a juggernaut in its own right. So obviously the market was willing to accept that premium price, and obviously has continued to accept increasingly higher and higher and higher prices. And I think that's the angle that Dave takes on it, which I understand, is that obviously a lot of long-term hobbyists don't like that the price keeps going up. And I understand it. But the problem is, and this is kind of an assertion I've made a lot of times, the laws of economics have not been violated here. What that means is that as long as people are willing to keep paying it, and the thing is, it doesn't have to be collectors. It can be speculators. It can be speculators selling to speculators. But it doesn't matter who's buying it. It doesn't matter who's paying it. As long as someone is paying it, it will continue. And it has no reason not to continue, because if you're a seller, you'd be stupid to leave money on the table just because of some weird, allegiance to this notion of the hobby. So I understand the frustration from the collector perspective, but at the same time, it doesn't fly. So 1989 to me doesn't make any sense, because by that point, Upper Deck was just a reflection of the time it came in on, and it was going to happen either then or later, or it could have happened earlier if somebody had been a little more aggressive. So I don't think really that makes sense as far as the cost perspective. And I believe his co-host in the podcast, I want to say Steve, and if I'm wrong, I'll correct myself on the screen. I believe it was Steve. He said a phrase that I actually really like, that actually plays much better. I would say kids' hobby is maybe the wrong phrasing. Maybe it's when we're looking at a time when the hobby was more kid friendly. And if we're talking about kid friendly, in terms of allowing, for reasonable price for the cards and all that, and allowing more kids to be involved in it because of a more accessible price point. If we're talking about kid friendly, well, then I'm more than comfortable with us picking whatever time you want. You can talk about Upper Deck increasing the bar, making it less kid friendly, and setting the bar for the future where kids wouldn't necessarily be involved in all of the different products, where up until that point, most kids were involved in it. And the other reason that I kind of reject the pricing and accessibility version of this argument is because, affordability is relative. If you've got somebody who's got rich parents, for them, the packs don't cost anything because their parents bought them. So for them, it could have been $1, it could have been $100, it could have been $1,000. It wouldn't make any difference. If you're opening the packs and enjoying them, you're opening the packs and enjoying them. So from your perspective, the price doesn't actually make any difference. But obviously, from a conventional hobbyist, someone who actually works and pays for their own packs, well then, yeah, the price is very relevant. A $5 pack is a big difference than a $50 or $100 pack. But so the affordability thing doesn't work for me. I understand it and I get that argument, but it doesn't fly. So I'm going to reject that time period for me. But you can use it if you want to use it as part of debate and argument. And like I said, we're not going to get a definitive answer here today, but I'm happy to opening up the debate. So that's one time period we can talk about. Another time period we can talk about is when the price guide became popularized. So we're talking basically Beckett. We're talking about 1984. So that's another time period, because for a lot of kids, that was the first exposure to kind of pricing, and establish a pecking order for pricing in terms of cards. So the 52 Topps Mono was worth more than a 52 Topps Common, even a 52 Topps High Number Common. So from that perspective, you could argue that's another time. But at the same time, that Beckett wasn't the first price guide. It was the most popular price guide. It became the Bible of the hobby because it became the most popular. But there were price guides, written price guides like that, going back to the late 70s, so like 79. So it could be the price guide. You could argue that. Or you could argue when the first full-time dealers came into effect, or for when the first national happened. The first national happened in 1980. That was the first gathering of collectors and dealers. Or when the first, like I said, full-time dealers came into play. Kit Young would be an example of a really early national full-time dealer, and that would be about the mid-70s, so 74, 75. So all of a sudden, we're all the way back to 1975. So at this stage, now we're already back 45 years. So when was it last a kid's hobby if we keep having to go further and further back in time? Well, the thing is, at this point, I could stop. And traditionally, when I've talked about this a little bit more lightly, I usually stop about here. But I've had the chance to do a little bit of reading on some stuff that I wanted to read up a little bit more on because I remembered there was a little bit of this and I wanted to make sure I got it right. So I wanted to do some research. So now I'm going to share my screen with you and I want to share with you a couple of things. And I want to make sure that you know that these links and these resources that I'm going to show you, I'm going to include links for them in the description if you want to check them out yourself. But we're going to do a little hobby history lesson here. And as we go through it, I'm going to show you kind of why my thinking on this has changed a little bit. Okay, so we're going to do a little screen share here. All right, so this here is an article written by George Vrechek. I probably totally butchered that. But this was actually a little article written back in 2012 that was reprinted in Sports Collectors Digest magazine that was talking about Jefferson Burdick's first catalog of cards. For those of you who may not be aware, Jefferson Burdick was one of, it's listed here, obviously, the father of card collecting. And the reason being is that he produced what was originally called the United States. I want to make sure I read this correctly. So let's scroll down for a second. It was originally called the United States Card Collectors Catalog, which eventually became the American Card Catalog. Now, for those of you who are a little bit more hobby historians, the American Card Catalog should be a little bit more familiar to you. When you think of the American Card Catalog, if you know what a T206 is, a T205, a T207, a T3 Turkey Red, an M116 magazine card, an E96 caramel card, if any of that rings a bell or even sounds remotely familiar to you, that came from the American Card Catalog. But the first version of it came out in 1939, and at that time it was actually called the United States Card Collector Catalog. And it was the first attempt at that time to compile, because hobbyists had been working on the whole idea behind trying to compile these lists, trying to figure out how these sets work. Because you have to understand that even though the T206 set by that point had already been out for a long time, you didn't know it was the T206 set because it basically hadn't been invented, the idea. You had these cards that were of the same series and you were pretty sure they belonged together, but the research had been ongoing to try to figure out, like, okay, do all of these belong together? Should the polar bear backs be with the Piedmont backs? Are they exactly the same thing? Should they be a different set? Should they be considered separately? What does the checklist actually look like? How many cards are in it? And stuff like that. And that is where this effort became a thing that actually moved the hobby forward by creating some of these classifications. Now, additional research over time has added more information, and we've learned more about them in that time since, but somebody needed to lay the groundwork by actually putting together some kind of a classification system to help everybody figure out what was what. And I'll explain in a second why this is relevant. So in addition to the fact that he was obviously very responsible for putting together a lot of the research that obviously the hobby has continued to build off of since then, the American Card Catalog is important because in addition to coming up with those classifications and all that information, you also had information that could be used as pertaining to considering different prices. Now, this is important. Like I said, the first of these published was in 1939. Now, one of the other links I'm going to give you is going to be to this. This is actually an excerpt taken out of the first edition of what would later become the American Card Catalog, but first was the United States Card Catalog. And this was a section inside of it because a lot of people think about the catalog part, but they don't realize that even in the 1939 edition, there was a little bit on prices. So let's get into this for a second. Remember, I said Beckett was the first like national known price guide, and there were some price guides before that. But now we're going all the way back to 1939. Way back. We're pushing it way back here. Now let's get a couple pieces of information from this excerpt that I think are going to be interesting for you. So in pertains to prices here, hopefully you can read that, but I'll read it to you here a little bit. The fixing of card values is a difficult matter. In this catalog, a price has been set for everything possible. So think about this. In 1939, Jefferson Burdick has tried to put prices on some of these cards. Why would you do that? So I presented this to one of my fellow hobbyists, one of my hobby buddies here, and he was thinking about it like, well, maybe to help, try to figure out like trade values and such like that. And it's a reasonable idea. But let's keep reading a little bit here. Let's talk about a little bit more. It is possible. It is impossible, of course, to completely satisfy everyone in the matter of prices. Some seems to think that they should start at 5 cents and with the sky the limit. Others favor 1 cent for everything. Both obviously are not correct. Now stop me if that sounds familiar to a lot of debates and arguments about, oh, these cards cost too much. Oh, this is not fair. This is not right, whatever. That's fair enough. But let me give you this. Many old collectors remember the heydays of 1890 and 1910 when collecting cigarette cards was almost a universal pastime. Thinking back whimsically to the 19th century. Prices in those days sometimes soared to 50 cents and $1 for a single badly wanted card. Now hold on. Stop. Record scratch. Are you suggesting that as far back as the 1890s or even 1910, so we're not talking about like Bowman and Topps and all that. We're not even talking about Gowdy. We're not talking about, play ball cards. We're talking about the era of the T206 in the latter portion of it. And we're talking about Old Judge, the original Allen and Ginter, Mayo's cut plug, and these kind of cards. Even in this era, we're talking about, because these packs that they came in, the cigarette pack that the card was inside of, because the card provided also a hard cardboard backing to help the cigarettes kind of stay intact. So these things cost basically a cent back in those days. So you're suggesting that something that came out of a 1 cent pack could be sold for as much as 50 to 100 times its original value? Who would do such a thing? Outrageous. Insane. Also not new. And not exactly shocking to me, but it might be a little surprising for some. But it's acknowledged right here in this thing. Also from 1939. So remember, we've got kind of a very primitive version of a price guide here in 1939, acknowledging that there were secondary market prices back in the 1890s and in 1910 in the era of T206 and such. So collectors that wanted it might have had to pay a premium. Shocking, but true. So I'll get back to where that's relevant again in a minute. Now, let me go down here. They give some examples here about stamp collecting and such, but right here, the prices in this catalog are intended to show comparative values of sets and to facilitate sales and exchanges among collectors. They are intended for single items selected from approvals or sent against want lists. Cards sold in lots are not valued at these rates, but should be discounted on a wholesale basis. So, really important point here. It's laid out here in black and sepia. The prices in this catalog are intended to show comparative values of sets and to facilitate sales and exchanges. So not just trades, but sales. They were prices to help you try to figure out relative price so that you could facilitate sales or trades or a little bit of both. This is 1939. This is why I'm amending my original thought process. I thought to myself, and my thought process was that it had been many decades since the hobby had been more of a pure, kind of a kids thing, kids pastime. And the reason why I say we're not going to get agreement on this is because, again, it depends on your goalposts. If you're talking about collectors selling to collectors for a profit, well, then obviously we can go back here based on this to the 1890s. So you would have had to be like 140 years old to be able to think back to the pure days of where you just traded cards for cards. So I doubt most of you can make that argument for me. But at the same time, Dave's original thesis here is not a bad one, and I understand it. But the reason why I say I struggle with it, and this is actually another counter argument that I'll hear, no doubt from some folks, is that, well, when I was a kid, even though that's much later than this time period, when I was a kid, myself and my friends and all that, we traded cards, irrespective of value. I traded Mickey Mantles for like common cards, or if you want to use hockey example, I traded Wayne Gretzky rookies for like a common card to fill out my 79-80 set. And my response to you is, I have no problem with that. I'm not going to disagree with your memories. I can't argue with you. I wasn't there. And I totally believe you. But that doesn't change the fact that there were collectors out there who understood or acknowledged a pecking order of value. They would have looked at that deal and said, well, I'll trade you the Gretzky rookie, but you're going to have to do better than a couple of comments because this Gretzky is worth more. Even if there wasn't a price guide out for it, they still would have looked at it and said, well, this Gretzky is more desirable than these stack of comments. So if you want to make this deal, you're going to have to sweeten it up. You're going to have to give me something else. Give me a Gordie Howe card. Give me a Bobby Hall card. Give me something else to make it a little bit more balanced. That understanding existed whether it happened inside of your trading group or not. And I guess maybe the only way I can really explain this, try to like convey this, is if I gave you an extreme example. If we take today, 2020, well, right now I think most collectors acknowledge it's no longer a kid's hobby for whatever criteria you want to use, because retail is hard to get, because the prices are so high, because there's expensive packs. Kids can't really get into it involved in that same way unless their parents are wealthy or whatever the case may be. All valid arguments, totally get it. But imagine for some reason we had an island where we sent off a bunch of kids and their families, and they're isolated from the rest of the world. They don't know the existence of eBay. They don't know the existence of any of these markets. And we drop off a bunch of really expensive product, really expensive card products. But even though these kids have never been exposed to eBay and any of these things, they don't have access to price guides or any of it. They're given these boxes and they're able to open this up. They've been exposed to the sport, so they enjoy the sport. So amongst themselves, they're trading and collecting and doing all these things and making trades just like the old-fashioned days, where they're trading cards that they need to try to fill out their sets. It's pure. Now the question is, so is that a kid's hobby? Well, I guess it is. But then I guess the question becomes, so is it a reflection of what's going on the outside, or is it a reflection of what your perception is at the time that you're doing it? Did it stop being a kid's hobby not at some kind of a specific time period? Because I can argue based on this that it was never a kid's hobby for 1 second. The fact is it was more kid-friendly. I want to bring back that phrase from earlier in this conversation. It was more kid-friendly back in the day. When you were a kid, it was more affordable. Therefore, it was more accessible to you. Therefore, you and your friends could have collected. And therefore, you didn't have a sense of value or anything yet. You hadn't been exposed to any of that. So it was much easier for you to conduct that kind of an exchange. Because here's the thing. Now we know. Now we've been exposed to it. We've been tainted, so to speak, by value. Well, the reality is this. If you have I'll use again an extreme example. If you had like a Sidney Crosby rookie patch worth tens of thousands of dollars, you could trade that for a common if you want to. Nobody's stopping you. You can do it right now. You got a LeBron James rookie? Trade it for a common. Knock yourself out. Feel free. You probably won't do it because you would know that, well, it's worth this, or I had to pay good money to get this, or whatever the case may be. The point being that at this stage, you've been ingrained with the value. You've been ingrained with the pecking order. And the interesting thing that something like this brings up, so I'm going to stop sharing here for you. So hopefully you kind of get my point with that. And like I said, I provided links to it because this image came from a Net54 article. Net54 Baseball article, Net54 Baseball post, where somebody actually bought the catalog and was nice enough to scan the pages, which was super helpful and super interesting. For research purposes, it's fantastic. And I'll include a link in the description for you if you want to check it out yourself. It's fascinating. It's actually very interesting to check out and read. But the point is, you have to think back, even in 1939, there's not only an acknowledgement of prices, there's not only an acknowledgement that there's a pecking order of prices. They felt that there was a requirement and a need to reflect that. Because otherwise, they could have just put a catalog in with a checklist, and what's the point of having prices? Why can't we treat the Honus Wagner like it's the same price as a Southern Leaguer? Why is a Southern Leaguer worth more than a common? Well, because it's scarcer and it's probably more desirable if for somebody that wants to complete a set. And that's how that worked. Desirability and availability and scarcity, all these factors that come into price. They were factors that came into price in 1939. And before that, obviously. Because, like I said, some collectors were willing to pay 50 or 100 times what it would have cost originally to pull it out of the tobacco pack. Why? Because they understood that if you wanted it and the other person valued it more than 1 cent, you'd have to pay more than 1 cent. And the point made there is that even Jefferson Burdick, in terms of this catalog, acknowledges that some people think everything should be a penny because that was the original price for some of these cards inside of the pack. And others think that it should be, 5 cents and sky's the limit, exactly from the excerpt I read for you. And we're kind of at that today. Why are these things worth so expensive? Why do they cost so much? And the answer is supply and demand. And as pertains to when it stopped being a kid's hobby, to me, my stance is it never was. My stance is that kids participated in it. And over time, more and more adults showed up. But I contend that the adults were in the corner of the room the whole time. Because the initial collectors that were collecting these cards in the 1800s, they lived in a world where cards didn't exist. And then they came into being. And I doubt that kids right out of the block necessarily would have been the primary consumers of this because you got them out of tobacco products. Now, I would suspect as kids got exposed to the game and maybe got interested in it, because you have to understand that early baseball was actually a very I would say dangerous is one way of putting it, but also kind of an unsavory sport. Because if you do any research in your baseball history, you would know that there were some unsavory characters that played baseball, especially when it became professional. Not exactly the kind of role models that you would want kids hanging around. Although there were probably kids around, that probably wouldn't be the first thing that they would gravitate to. But as it became a more popular and became the national pastime in the United States, it obviously increased in popularity. And I wouldn't doubt that they would have wanted to grab those tobacco cards. They probably would have asked some of the adults for it. Or maybe when they got the tobacco packs, they would say, hey, can we have the cards? Or hang out outside of the store and say, hey, did you buy any cigarettes? Can I have the card? And some of the adults would have, for them, it would have been worthless. So they would have just given the kid the card. And that's how they would have put it together. But for some of these adult collectors who were compiling these early checklists, for them, they were collecting. They were the initial collectors that got the thing rolling. There's a good chance that the majority of the initial collectors that got the whole thing going were adults and not kids. As time went on, it became more popular. It got associated with bubblegum. Well, then kids got more involved because, well, the kids like the gum as well. So that all became part of a cohesive thing that made it more attractive for kids, increased the amount of kids in the collecting population, pushed the adults to the side, but they never went away fully. They stuck around. And some of these kids later on became adults who then joined that group, and the group got bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And now we're into today. There are still kids in the hobby today. And here's the thing. We could quadruple prices overnight, and there will still be some kids in the hobby. The percentages, though, are skewing more and more into the adult side of it as the price has gone up. That is all true. But if the whole idea is that we've stopped being a kid's hobby, like I said, my contention is that we never were. But kids were involved because the hobby was more kid friendly back then. It might be just semantics to you, and that's completely fair. But for me, there is a distinction between kid friendly, which it's less kid friendly now than it ever was. That part I agree. And a kid's hobby, which it wasn't from the outset. So at best, if you want to argue that case, well, then you can argue that it was an adult's hobby that became a kid's hobby for a while, and then the adults took it back eventually. We could fall somewhere in between, but that would be closer to a more accurate, I think, picture of what it is, because history doesn't really back you, especially when in the 1890s and even 1910s, what kid has 50 cents or a dollar? It wasn't the kids buying that. It was adults. So like I said, I leave it to you, and we're not going to get complete agreement on this. I totally understand. I just wanted to present this to you just so you can consider that it turns out the whole buying and selling secondary market of cards has been around for much longer than I think most hobbyists want to even consider. Because Jefferson Burdick was already reflecting it back then and harkening back to the heydays of 1890 and 1910. And in 1939, he was including prices because they felt they needed to. Because at that point, the hobby had already been established, and some of those markets had been established for over 50 years. Just some stuff to think about. Again, we're not going to get a final answer or definitive thing on this, but it's just something interesting that I thought was worth bringing up. Anyway, that's already, I think, long enough for this video. I just wanted to present some of that to you. Links are in the description for some of the stuff that we talked about. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Am I completely out to lunch? Am I completely out of my mind? Fun fact, I probably am. But on this one, I feel I'm pretty strong. But at the same time, we can debate. Maybe you've decided that there's a random time. Maybe it stopped being a kid's hobby in 1987 on February 14th. I don't know. You can make that argument if you want to. I don't know what you've got for that one, but that'd be kind of fun to hear. So if you've got any thoughts or comments, I'd be happy to hear them. And actually, let me finish off with one more thing here. So as far as this is concerned, this is where my stance is on it. And you don't have to agree with me, and that's perfectly fine. But one thing I do want to kind of convey as well is that I don't think it matters whether it was a kid's hobby or not, or when it stopped being a kid's hobby or not, or what it is, because as a collector today, that shouldn't really have an impact on you. And if it does, then that is a concern for me, because it's like, what difference is it going to make? Because regardless of whether you agree with kind of my general premise or whether you want to pick one of these checkpoints that I presented to you, then regardless, Pandora's box is not getting closed up again. It's already been opened. We know too much. We've seen too much. We can't go back. So it just becomes, as a collector, you kind of have to decide what you want to do going forward. If you want to keep kids in the hobby, then you're going to have to think of some clever ways to keep them engaged or get them engaged or whatever it is. I'm a little more pessimistic on that than some people, but that's me. If you want to take on the task of trying to, repopulate that side of the hobby by putting more kids into it, more power to you. And I applaud you for your efforts. But I still think it's important that regardless of where you want to try to get the hobby to go, you should still at least consider where we've been. And hopefully this at least provided you some background to be able to understand what that is. Anyway, as I said, it's open to, I'm happy to hear any comments or thoughts on this. We'll leave it at that for now, and we'll be back with another video soon.